I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Jessica Anthony has a banger of a new novella, and I love this book so much. It's called The Most. It is about a marriage that is not doing well. It's also set in 1957, and it really starts with a woman called Kathleen not being willing to get out of the swimming pool. And I can hear some eyebrows going up out in the world, so I'm going to ask Jessica Anthony, the author of The Most, to give us a tiny bit of spoiler-free background on Kathleen.
Thank you, Miwa. And it's just really thrilling for me to be here. Hi to everyone who's listening. Kathleen Beckett is the protagonist of The Most with her husband, Virgil Beckett. They are facing what is a seminal day in the course of their 9-year marriage. And Kathleen emerged, I would say, first out of my interest in reading women who were writing fiction and plays and poetry in the 1950s. So I'm talking about Carson McCullers, Flannery O'Connor, Patricia Highsmith, Gwendolyn Brooks, Alice Childress, Grace Paley, and a number of other really amazing writers of that time period. And I started to wonder why I was interested in these particular voices, writing in this particular time period when everyone's understanding of American history is that the radical decade that we lived through was, of course, the 60s. But the 60s would not have been possible without the 50s. And so if you kind of, rub some of these writers up against one another and you start to study the way in which their female protagonists are observing their worlds and reacting to their environments, you start to see this sort of extraordinary habit and pattern of women who are trying to report their humanity from a time period that has that wants nothing to do with their humanity at all. I started getting interested in the possibility of a character who could speak to a 21st century reader who would in some ways illuminate for us something about the way that we understand relationships now through the lens of 1957. And so that's how Kathleen really began, was out of reading those writers.
Well, I'm also going to add Sylvia Plath, The Bell Jar, and
sure.
Anne Sexton's poetry. And I realize I've tipped us a little bit into the early 60s, but as I frequently find myself saying, well, 1991 and 1992 are basically the 80s still. Like, there's that little bit of residue in the early years.
We'll allow that residue. I mean, basically, you look at when the work came out. So Paley's Little Disturbances of Man was published in 1959. So clearly she was writing those stories through the 50s.
Right.
I mean, A Raisin in the Sun, I think was 1962, maybe?
Yeah, but I'm sure she had been working on that well before. I mean, publication dates.
Exactly.
It's squishy.
I was counting those early 60s. I mean, because that's when the work was being generated, was in the 50s.
And I love the omniscient narrator. The way you use the third person in this book, I couldn't put it down. And it doesn't hurt that it takes place over the course of 8 hours on an unseasonably hot day. And, quite a lot of America has been having a heat wave in the last couple of weeks. So we kind of can't escape the heat, but this is November. It's 1957. Kathleen has popped herself back into a bathing suit that may have seen better days. And they are currently, she and her husband and her 2 sons are living in an apartment building that maybe was not their first choice, but they have plans. And you just conjure this world, right? And I realize I'm dipping a little bit into this sort of language of fantasy and whatnot, but you really do have to build a world. Like, everything's a little run down on the heels. People have plans that may or may not happen. I love this. I really, I was so in it, and I read it in a single sitting, which I love to be able to do that. But Virgil, Kathleen's husband, kind of a unique dude. He surprised me a little more than Kathleen did. I felt like I knew Kathleen, and Virgil has some quirks, but also is from the West Coast, and they meet at college. And so can we get into Virgil's head for a second?
Yeah, and thank you for the compliments. I mean, it's always a little strange to hear readers talking about the work after, it's just been mine in my little cave for so long. But thank you. It's great to hear. Yeah, Virgil is a California guy. He grew up in Monterey. He is just conventionally handsome to the point of irrationality. He has sort of been gifted with a kind of beauty that his wife has never been particularly interested in or had access to. And so I was interested in the notion of a woman who would be married to a very handsome man. I thought that might be a kind of unusual way to look at the bridge between them and how it might be, how that bridge might face some kind of threat. And so naturally, as Kathleen is getting older and she's had children, there is a kind of awe in the way she is now looking at her husband, who has been essentially just parading through his life, with relative ease. Jobs come his way because of his looks. He makes wild assumptions about what he can do because he's just this handsome young white man who is in his position in society. He's lucked out, basically, being in this particular time period, being this particular kind of man. But he hasn't lucked out in many other ways. He has found himself on the East Coast because of a totally illogical dream that makes no sense. He thinks that he is going to become a really famous saxophone player. I mean, it's like, there's a really famous 30 Rock episode about, John Hamm living in the bubble. I don't know if you've seen this.
I haven't, but...
Okay, well, 30 Rock is not what I would call a literary reference, but it's actually kind of a wonderful, absurd character who goes through life just assuming that everyone else is living the same way that he's living because he's so handsome. And so, Virgil is an innocent. He's a naif in many ways. He has never been forced to do the kind of self-exploration and self-examination that is typically required of your average human male because he's never... the challenge has never been in front of him to do it.
He's not a bad dude. I mean, he's not a bad guy. He's hapless. he's a little hapless. And
he's hapless. That's the word.
And I say that, and I had so much fun with this novella. And I am going to call it a novella because I do think it's closer to a novella. It's that wonderful bridge, and we'll come back to the word bridge, but it's a wonderful bridge between a short story and a novel. And you can do so much with tone and character and place and time. Because even though we are sitting in the space of 8 hours in a pool, we get a lot of story from both sides, from Kathleen and from Virgil and their families and their experiences of the world. I mean, Kathleen could have been a professional tennis player, sort of. And yet we see the moment where she's like, yeah, this will be easier. And she's really young and he's really young and they're clearly not fully prepared. So we meet them sort of when they're not quite teenagers, early 20s. And then we get them again sort of almost 10 years later, and the swing in their experience and who they are. You tend not to write really, there's some people who just write at 500 pages and that's what they do. That's all of the books are 500 pages. And I'm wondering if that was ever a conscious decision for you to just be like, no, I just write short and tight and not wasting any kinds of words kind of thing. I mean, every writer's different.
I don't like to set any kind of firm rules for myself about what kind of fiction I write or don't write. My first novel, The Convalescent, I think was over 300 pages, but it also had a bifurcated narrative. And so I do move around in time a lot. And that's something I've observed as sort of a habit. But this particular novella, and I will joyfully stand by its definition as a novella is largely misunderstood to be a fiction of a certain length, when in reality, it is a form of fiction that typically falls into a certain length. And so there are certain demands upon you as a writer of novellas that are very different from writing a novel. You are not going to see long immersive scenes of Kathleen, say, having coffee with her friends. You're not going to drop back into history and watch Virgil's father get married, for example. But what you are going to get is a very deliberate kind of narrative positioning in which the present moment of the fiction feels very tense and very tight and very urgent. And so it creates this rather magical sensation of being both concise and expansive in the same moment, which means that every sentence has to be doing a different kind of work than in a novel, a typical novel, where there's just more breathing room. So in that way, the novella has a sort of kinship with short fiction, which has the same kind of demands at the line level, but it's much more expansive. There typically is some kind of an escalation. And it comes with this marvelous feeling of having someone verbally telling you the story. It belongs in some ways more to the oral tradition than anything. And so it's a very special kind of fiction that has its own rewards for writing. And I actually, when I sat down to write this book, I was thinking of it originally as one of a trio of novellas. And so this was going to be the second novella. But then there are numerous conversations that went into this, but fundamentally, the decision was made to have it be a standalone story. And I'm glad that we've arrived here because I think it can stand on its own. And I love what you were saying about that experience of having a single sitting read. Edgar Allan Poe is famous for his language about how literature should create a single effect. And the novella, I think, is unique in that it captures that sense of a single effect, but keeps you there for a sustained period of time. In this case, it's probably no more than 2 or 3 hours to read it.
I'm also thinking of Foster by Claire Keegan and by Paula Harding. I mean, there are some novellas that really do capture the world.
Desperate Characters, Paula Fox.
Oh, yeah. Definitely the Paula Fox. I mean, there are times where I do want a 500-page novel, sure, but really, I feel like I know so much about Kathleen and Virgil and the choices they make, and I understand the choices they make, and they both do some interesting stuff, and obviously you and I are going to leave out all the juicy bits so people can have the fun of reading the book in one go. But I really do feel like I know both of these people, and I genuinely do understand how they got where they are. I think I have a feeling for what they might go on to do, but I'm not sure I'm right. And I think everyone is going to have their own reading of
what happens after the day ends.
When she gets out of the pool, because both of them, neither of them's a dummy.
Right.
They are equally matched intellectually. I mean, in terms of experience, there's a difference in class, there's a difference in some other stuff, but it's wild watching this sort of play out between the two of them. And I know you said you're not a planner per se and you don't have rules, but I feel like you had to really understand who both Kathleen and Virgil were walking into this, because if you didn't, then we would have gotten a really weird lopsided story that wouldn't have been as propulsive a read.
Well, you'd be surprised at what you can learn about your characters when you're willing to trust that your subconscious knows what it's doing. It's maybe a weird thing to talk about because it kind of is counterintuitive to the way that we often will talk about reading books and reading literature, and even hearing other writers talk about their work. They'll often say, what I tried to do and what I wanted to do. But in reality, very few of those writers are sitting there with a fully formed outline and a complete understanding for who these people are when they sit down to read. I mean, you have sort of a sense of the thing, but it's in the process of writing these chapters, and they can be messy chapters. It can go awry. You start over, you start again, you revise, you rewrite until you get that sentence, that line that rings true. And so to me, that's what I love about this, that experience of feeling like an investigative journalist into these characters. Who are these people? Why is Kathleen refusing to get out of the pool? I didn't know when I started writing. I was like, she just won't get out. Why won't she get out? You know? But it's such a wonderful, creative problem. It's a problem to solve, and it takes time to really know, oh, I see. There's a whole story about her history that is going to help me to understand who she is and why on this particular day she's deciding to stay put in this pool that no one has swum in this condominium complex, this apartment complex, for years. So it's this abandoned pool that the landlord has agreed to clean up and to fix for her. Even her children refuse to swim in it. So she is the first body into this pool in a really long time. And so I think the newness of her being in this water was just really a thrilling kind of sensory idea to sort of investigate in story. But of course, there's a point in the telling. There's a moment in the writing where you realize what's going on and you think, oh my God, I know why she's not leaving this pool. And you feel this, like, I don't know, it's an indescribable feeling. You get overwhelmed, because the character now is in charge. And once you hit that moment as a writer, it's very exciting because you can then see the ending and you can write towards it.
And I know we're firmly in 1950s. You've given us a lot of markers in the book itself for time and moments. I mean, Sputnik 2 has been launched and Laika the dog is in space. And so we're firmly in this sort of mid-century American moment, right? America is becoming the country we know. Like, we're about to hit Mad Men, right? Talk about John Hamm reference. Apparently this is going to be an episode that John Hamm keeps appearing in. But again, like, if you think about the response that sort of we had as a culture to Mad Men and that series as it ran, it's this weird mix of, right, nostalgia and also reimagination, because that moment in history, right? Like, here we are saying, well, this is going to become the American epoch and we're just coming out of World War II and we did all of these things and City on a Hill, all this kind of stuff. And man, it's messy. There's the mythology of the time, and then there's just people like Kathleen and Virgil and the folks in their circles, and it is just messy, 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 and not at all mythological.
Well, and it's so interesting to talk about this idea of this 50s mythology, because it's something that I was very aware of while I was writing. I mean, there are all of these kind of classic trappings of white suburban American culture in that time period. The going to church, the playing of golf, the going to the bars and whatnot. And a lot of those same trappings still exist, in 2024. I mean, there are a lot of lives still being lived in this kind of, expression of behavior. But we have to remind ourselves, at least I have to remind myself when I'm working in a historical time period, that I'm actually not interested in writing historical fiction. Because I feel that oftentimes writing historical fiction, we can fall victim to actually believing in the fact of our own recreation when the art of fiction is simulacrum. It's never going to be the real thing. And so what I'm interested in is finding that sort of angle of contemporaneousness that enables us to kind of feel situated, against or aligned with the 50s mythology, and looking at it and criticizing it without pulling us out of it at the same time. So it's a very kind of delicate needle to thread in some ways, because if that omniscient narrator was too judgmental of this world, then the dream would collapse and you wouldn't feel as though you were actually reading, the truth about Kathleen and Virgil, which is always, it's Coleridge's construct. We're working with poetic faith here. But at the same time, I am very interested in absurdity and surrealism and the potential for irrationality to enter into a rational world. So finding moments in the story where we see perhaps a repetition of an observation, where Kathleen may report something one way and Virgil restates it, but in a slightly different way. These are these sort of gentle nudges towards, this irrationality, this sense of being a little bit unstable in the story, which also I enjoyed playing with when creating the novella's structure. So we open with Kathleen dropping into her pool, and yet it's Virgil's perspective. And so in chapter 2, the day begins again, and this time it begins with Kathleen.
I'd read your earlier book, Enter the Aardvark, which is kind of a very wild, laugh-out-loud political satire, also very short. You play with both second and third person narration, which is a device I happen to love. I mean, that immediacy that you get from that second person, I think I'm still fond of Bright Lights, Big City for, I think that's a big part of it is that voice, right? You're like, oh, hello, my 20s are back. But this tonally, it's much more timeless. It's a little more John Cheever. It's a little more Richard Yates. It's a little more, I know all of these women have contributed to the creation of the thing, but those are some of the voices that have sort of stuck from that moment, right? And I love the way you switch gears, because also I reread Aardvark as I was prepping for this show. And I didn't quite feel like I was reading two different writers, but they are very different reading experiences. And I'm just wondering how it feels to look back on art, because also Aardvark pubbed at a very weird moment in our collective cultural history. I mean, it was the
March 2020.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, that was a lot of books that came out in that moment really didn't quite find the audiences that they might have, simply because it was a weird moment for everyone. But switching gears for you, I'm assuming the story just, you went through and discovered what you needed to discover, but they are really different books.
They are. I love voice in fiction. The idea that a voice can feel like a narrative voice can feel like its own color on the page. It has its own sound. It has its own color. And Aardvark is a loquacious, fast, short. It's 180 pages, mm-hmm. but it's got a kind of ferocious interest in language. I felt that if I were to kind of retain that voice with these long sentences and this erudite prose, the most would have been a performative novel and not an immersive novel. And so I wanted to get excited about voice in a very different way. And so I thought about just what would it be like if I could write essentially in the quietest, simplest language I could find that would allow for the reader to kind of forget that they're in the act of reading. And so the opening of Enter the Aardvark is a whirling mass of vapors is unhinged, hurtling through outer space for an infinity until it collides with an ellipsis which does not let go, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it goes on for like a page or so. And the opening of the most is simply Kathleen Beckett awoke feeling poorly. And there's a cadence to that sentence. It's simple, but there is a sense of the poetic motion of the syllables in that line. And once I feel like I have a voice in my head, then the writing becomes exciting for me. And I forget that I'm in the act of writing. I just turn myself over to the voice, and then the characters begin to present themselves. I don't know. For me personally, voice is it's a motor. It's like and you're just driving in a different car. You're the same driver, but sometimes you're driving the limo, right? And sometimes you're driving the clunky little Fiat. So
voice is the thing that I connect with first. I tend to read more for language. Like if nothing happens, I'm okay. I don't need to like characters. I just need to be in the thing.
Yeah.
And so, that brings you things like, The Cement Garden, Ian McEwan. Like I'm just thinking of all of these sort of wild short novels, some of which have, continued onward and others like I can remember bits of, and I'm like, do I actually remember the title? And so I'm going to avoid some of it just so I don't mess up titles and send people on wild goose chases and whatnot. But I do think that if you can find the voice that someone will follow, right? It doesn't matter what the genre is. It doesn't matter what where you're going necessarily. It's just like, I want to hang out with whoever or whatever this is. And it's that hanging out thing that's like, right, I've just basically described fiction as vibes. That's essentially what I'm saying is like, if I like the vibe of the thing, it doesn't matter if I'm in a swimming pool in Delaware in 1957. I just want to be there. And I want to be with these people. And I want to have the story sort of unfold. I would like to be surprised. That's kind of cool when that happens.
Yeah.
It doesn't always happen for me because I read so much. But there were so many moments in the most where I did laugh out loud. And I think that might say more about me. I wouldn't say this is laugh out loud the way Aardvark. Aardvark is, you will be crying. You'll be laughing so hard. But I did have moments because Kathleen will just slide in a line.
Oh, yeah.
Virgil will slide in a line. Like, they have a misunderstanding about thinking someone wants to see a movie. And the reasons why someone would want to see the movie. And it's just this wild miscommunication. I'm like, oh, wow. And I'm just, because the whole thing, and they're both very earnest about it. And it's like, well, of course and who hasn't been there, right? Like, you're wanting to do the thing with your person. You're kind of like, well, you want to do this, right? It's like, well, actually. And I just feel like they compound their problems because they can't, neither of them is built to have conversations like we can have now, right? Like, what's bothering you? Why are you anxious? Like, I don't even think either of them would know the word anxious. Like, it just wouldn't be in their vocabulary. They know things like, where's the pot roast? Where's dinner? The boys would like to be fed. Like, Chinese food is really novel and not anyone's idea of fun. You know, it's just, they are so real. Right? They are so of a time and of a place. And yet here I am in 2024 going, oh, you guys are great. Because you're just, I mean, like, here we are in 1950, mom is not having a good day. And she's sort of stuck, right? Like, it's not, I mean, she finds a little bit of an exit, but.
Well, there aren't too many moms having great days in the 1950s. I mean, but what's interesting to me about this period is that, you know, these are women who were unable to fully understand the water that they're in, to use a very specific and pointed metaphor for this book. In the same way that we cannot fully understand this world that we are living in. I mean, there are terms and structures that have been set around us, and we are just trying to pay the rent. You know, we are trying to feed ourselves. If we have children, we are responsible to them. And so, you know, in some ways, I think the terms for our lives are, you know, they haven't changed, you know, since this time period. You know, there are some perks. Women now can, like, we have birth control. We have, well, you know, the birth control pill, which was not available in the 50s. We can open our own bank account. We can buy real estate. You know, we can quote, you know, work where we want to work. I mean, there are many other problems with, you know, inequality, of course, right now. I mean, having lost Roe v. Wade, for example, was not super wonderful for us. But, you know, fundamentally, when we get up in the morning, you know, maybe there are some of us out there who live their lives this way, but I think it would be incredibly crippling and debilitating to do this every morning, to get up and say, Roe v. Wade, you know, what are we, how, I mean, unless you're working for Planned Parenthood, right? You've got to get through your day. You've got to get up. You've got to get showered. You've got to go do the job. You've got to, you know, go shopping or whatever it is. And so the idea of developing a protagonist who was a part of, you know, this 50s system, but who was not really rebelling against it, was something that interested me. I did not want Kathleen to be a radical who was trying to change her world. She's just trying to live in it. And she's flawed, like we are all flawed. And she's learning how to look at herself in a culture that doesn't ask her to ever look at herself. And she's rebelling in her own way against what it is she doesn't know or doesn't understand about who she is. So in many ways, it's like it's a personal, you know, struggle that she's having. She is, yes, a woman of her time, but she's also a very singular creature who comes out of this singular background, and she's animal, she's hot, she decides to get into the pool to cool off.
The payoff in her arc is really good. It is really like, I'm really, really trying to stay away from something that made me yell in the best possible. I was just like, oh, you did? Okay. Okay. And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about because there's a shift in perspective. And I was like, oh.
Yeah.
And it's still, I mean, other people might have played it with a different kind of tone. I just thought, oh, how are you going to get out of this, my friend? And I think she, whatever. Actually, maybe after we finish taping, I'm going to hit you with what I think happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because again, this is the kind of book where I do think people are going to walk away with their own interpretations of what happens next, what needs to happen next, what they hope happens next. I do feel like it is the kind of story where you do want to grab someone and be like, so, did you read the same book I just read? Because I think, wow. And, again, we all bring our own experience.
I've been hearing some wildly different interpretations from readers. So I'm excited to hear what people think. I mean, I have my own idea, but that doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. It's just my sense of the thing, what happens between these two characters. But I mean, part of the fun of the book, at least for me, was having the opportunity to think about plot in a whole new way. Enter the Aardvark is a big, active fiction where a lot of stuff happens. I mean, a gigantic taxidermied aardvark arrives on the front stoop of a congressman's townhouse. And over the course of 2 days, it brings down his entire reelection campaign.
Right.
And so a lot has to happen in an exterior way in order for that to be realized, by the end of the novel. But so this is, the interior answer to stuff happening. As you said earlier, I'm not, particularly interested in plot per se. I mean, the way in which we typically think about plot as a way of understanding fiction, that's a fallacy. It's just what happened in the story. So I love the idea of a novel that would take place, or a novella that would take place over the course of a very short period of time, following a character who essentially doesn't move. I mean, she is in the swimming pool for the entire day. And, there's a little bit of movement from her apartment. Yes, she gets down to the pool, in fairness. But the joy of the writing of the thing was, that stability in Kathleen. And we watch Virgil go golfing. That's an active moment in the story. But this is not high drama, Miwa, right? Like, this is not like, these are not like big events coming into play, because the big events have happened in the lives of these two characters. And so it becomes a fiction about the past. It becomes a fiction about memory and the fallacy of memory, the fallacy of history. And it becomes a fiction about the lies we've told ourselves and the moment at which the center can no longer hold, the moment at which in a marriage, a certain era has ended and another era either may begin or the marriage itself will collapse, depending on the character of that violence that's just occurred.
I think, too, there's a subtlety to this book, though. I mean, and I'm thinking of their children. I'm thinking of their boys for a second. And just, we don't know more than we need to know about these kids, right? But their personalities kind of tell us everything. And it's a line here. It's like, well, so-and-so lets his brother do the talking. And
then you know why.
Yeah. And it's so smart to just, we don't always need, like you said, you don't always need the story of Kathleen sitting down with her best friend having coffee and rolling through all of this. We can do a lot with a scene here and a scene there. It is somewhat cinematic, actually. And I don't know if that's deliberate or if it's just the way this particular book played out.
Well, I mean, the omniscient narrator is watching them. And that's a feeling I enjoyed, because it's omniscience. And so there's an all-knowing, voice behind the reportage. I think that the old adage, show don't tell is a total lie. Showing happens when you are in scene. That is how, character is slowly revealed in scene. But if you are writing omniscience, you have to do a heck of a lot of telling, especially if you are in omniscience in a very short novel or a novella. The telling is where the magic happens. The telling creates that sense of the oral tradition of being told a story, and you're curious to hear what happens next. And so the scenes that we get maybe feel slightly hyperbolized, and for that reason, because you're ready. I hope you're ready for a scene when you get it, because there are some longer passages of telling and narrative. But yeah, then suddenly you're allowed to watch them in action. There is not a lot of action, but the slightest gesture suddenly feels hugely important, based on the fact that you've just read a great deal of context about, who they are, where they've come from, who their parents are, where their parents have come from. This whole lineage of these two families that have existed in their various complicated, uncolliding ways up until the moment when Virgil happens to notice this young girl in a tennis outfit in the library's audio room. And that single act of noticing creates an entire fiction. It creates the drama that we read in the entire novel.
Well, you also have a great line from an interview you did elsewhere where you said, well, I need the veil of fiction to get to the truth. And I'm sort of slightly paraphrasing you, but I love that idea that you do actually need to be able to make stuff up in order to get to the sort of emotional truth of the thing, because I think Kathleen and Virgil are going to end up very surprised by a lot of things for a long time. The title, though, The Most, it works on a bunch of different levels. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping we can do a quickie 101 on why the most.
The word most in Czech and Slovak means bridge. And I wrote the first draft of the story while I was working as a bridge guard in Slovakia. I was living in the southernmost part of the country in this little village called Štúrovo. And the bridge that I was charged to guard is called the Maria Valeria Bridge. And I'll give you the quick story. The bridge was destroyed in World War I. It was rebuilt, and then the Nazis bombed it, and it remained unbuilt, broken for 60 years. And so finally, when the bridge was built again, repaired again, it was in 2001, and they created an artist in residence program in order to combat further fascism, the advance of fascism, the advance of further destruction upon this bridge. So in, the 3 months that I was guarding this bridge, my job was to write the act of creating is in itself, from their perspective, fighting the fascists. And so you can take that to mean what you will. I was excited about this charge. I felt this sense of, in particular, by the end of the residency, I felt this very strong sense of ownership of this bridge. I would cross it every single day, and then I would come back and I would write. And so this story was, without question, a direct response to that job I had been given, to fight, to think about connectivity, to think about bridging. And so what better way to do that in fiction, I felt, than to write the story of a troubled marriage, right? A marriage where the bridge is about to be bombed between them. And but I think I wanted to approach this story without any answers. I had no idea how I might address that question of, what would a troubled marriage in the 1950s look like, if there were to be some cataclysmic event that caused this kind of severe trouble. But that loose sort of atmospheric notion that I would get there and that I would figure that out by the end was what propelled me through the telling of the tale. It is a tale.
Okay, before we start dipping into potential spoiler territory, I love that backstory to the title, but we're dangerously close to maybe falling into the pool with Kathleen in a way that I'm not really willing to do. So Jessica, Anthony, thank you so much. I cannot wait for readers everywhere to get their hands on The Most. It is fantastic. Also, enter the Aardvark. Slightly different reading experience. Also really fabulous. Yeah, I think people are really, really going to carry Kathleen and Virgil around with them for a very long time.
Thank you so much, Miwa. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.